continue.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here with Will Freed, who is going to give a little presentation, but then is also here to have a kind of office hour / questions. So yeah, I'll give it to you, Will. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure. Well, I'm Will Freed. I'm a pianist. I'm local to Charlotte. I guess I'm one of the local ensembles. So it's weird. Can you call yourself an ensemble if it's just one of you? I'm not sure. But I've been here in Charlotte for 8 years now. So I'm starting my 9th, and this is my 4th year with Charlotte New Music. So I think this is the first time I've been officially an ensemble by myself, commissioning new works, as opposed to, I think when I first started, I was like the I was a ringer working with Bayo when there was a piano part, but I guess I've moved up, or not. I'm not sure. What I'm doing this year is a little different. I'm not from Charlotte. I've been besides this. Before this I was in San Diego, and I was at the UC San Diego in the music department doing a DMA, which is a big new music only program. And then before that, I was at NEC working with Steve Drury. I did a master's with him. That's how I started playing newer music, and now I've been in Charlotte for about 8 years. I teach at a small college just north of Charlotte, Davidson, which is, it's a very elite liberal arts college, but it's not preparing pre-professional musicians, or the few that are almost always singers. And most people are pre-med or pre-Wall Street or pre-law or whatever. But anyway, so that's sort of who I am and what I do. Last year, the presentation I gave this kind of presentation on various constructions of audience. And I suggested that the performers themselves were a kind of audience to write for. And that, I mean, partly if you make the make performers happy, or play or write things that are fun and interesting to play, you're more likely to get for them to continue to play your music. And then I gave a very self-serving presentation on the kinds of things that I like. This year I decided not to do that. And instead I thought I would talk about myself in a kind of oblique way by talking about notation. And partly because notation is the way by which we interface, we communicate. And I guess as an interpreter, it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I guess I'm sure you guys do too, from a different angle. There's an old, by way of a story to start this, I remember seeing an old interview with Robert De Niro, the actor. And the interviewer is asking him, to describe his philosophy of acting. How does he feel about method acting? How does he feel about Dustin Hoffman, that kind of thing? And I wish I could remember exactly the answer. He gives this really terse 3-word answer that's something like, I imitate behavior, or I observe behavior, or something just like that. And then the interviewer says, oh yeah, okay, I know, but can you, but elaborate for me, tell me. And De Niro just keeps repeating the same 3-word answer over and over. And not that I'm gonna have delusions of grandeur and imagine myself as De Niro, but if I had to describe what it is that I do, it would be something along the lines of, I interpret notation. So again, I spend a lot of time thinking about this and thinking about the possibilities of notation and what it might suggest. In that sense, notation, it's kind of language. We communicate via it. It's evolved over a long period of time. It does certain things better than others. It privileges certain things and over others. It's kind of an interesting thing, and it's become really over hundreds of years become a really rich language. And one of the things that interests me about it are what I think of it as notational synonyms. I mean, same like synonyms in language, different ways of notating the same idea. And I'm going to just, I have a little PowerPoint. Let me see if I can't, hold on. I'm going to share, it's been a while since I share screen desktop. Okay. I think I can do this. And is this working? Okay, sorry, okay, later. Okay, I don't know. So hopefully this will work. I should have tested this with Zoom. Let me see if I can share this now. Okay. And then I'm going to open this. And then see if I can't play. How do I play this presentation?
You can go to view slideshow. Yeah.
Oh, everyone see. Okay, so these are two different ways of notating for, and actually there's another. Oh, here we go. Actually, it's the third one. Different ways of notating 4 in the time of 3. So you have 4 in the time of 3 as a kind of tuplet here, and then broken up in 16th notes. And then you can even imagine it as a kind of metric modulation where you hear it's not really clear, but the 16th becomes a triplet. And then so instead of changing the notation, you just change the speed of the pulse. And you can get essentially from the point of view of, say, a MIDI score reading software, you get the same result. Where they're different, and actually this bottom one is kind of weird. You wouldn't really do this unless it was something you were going to continue with. But with just going to the top two, I mean, there are several differences here. One is in the information that is front and center, that's privileged, and then the other information that is hidden behind a layer of calculation. So in this first case, the tuplet, it's very clear that these are 4 even attacks, but how they relate to the beat is it takes a little calculation. And then in the one on the right, how they relate to the beat is very clear, but the evenness, you have to know 3/16, 3/16, and then you realize, oh, they're all even. So there's that layer of calculation there. And then with it, there's a kind of suggestion of an approach to realization. So the first one involves playing 4 even attacks and just kind of overlaying them over the steady pulse. And this one suggests an approach based on subdivision. And I mean, this is kind of a trivial example because a good player can go between these. I would say in terms of which to use, the tempo is probably the deciding factor, where a fast tempo would suggest the left-hand one, and a slower tempo, you would benefit more from subdividing. But this also brings up the issue that notation has to do 2 things at once. There are these 2 imperatives that it has to satisfy, and they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. And one of them is a didactic one, so that it presents a series of instructions, like almost like a recipe in a cookbook. You do this, do that, and you get you get the music. And then the other one is more of a representational one. It has to act as a kind of visual representation of what it should sound like. And potentially someone looking at it would have a sense, oh, this is supposed to sound like this from the notation. I would say in this case, the left-hand one is maybe better, more of a representational one, and the right-hand one is maybe more of a didactic one. But again, I mean, this is kind of a trivial example. So I'll just use an example, a real-life example. Here we go. And this is from John Luther Adams' 4,000 Holes, which is a piano percussion electronics duo from about 10 years ago. This is from a couple pages into the piano part. And if you look at it, there are 4 layers of material, and each one divides this 16-beat space evenly a certain number of times. So the top one divides it in 4. There are 4 even attacks. The second one, if you count the rest as the first one, obviously the hand's not big enough to play there. It divides it 5 times evenly, and you count this up and they're even. This next one divides it up 6 times, and the bottom one divides it up 7 times. And so to get a sense of the idea behind it, it takes a little calculation, not too much, but you could imagine a notation that looks like this, which would, here the idea is really clear, but there's, in terms of what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to approach it is, this is not at all helpful. And then in terms of, here's the John Luther Adams's notation at the top, and then this on the bottom here is my own kind of mental shorthand for how do I approach it. And so this, in this case, anytime I have a beat with multiple attacks, for example, this third beat here, which has attacks in 2 different voices, I rewrite one in terms of the rhythm of the other. So for example, this one is slightly before the second triplet. I say, okay, well, it's a grace note before, and then this one's on the triplet. And at his tempo, it's close enough. And this allows me to only subdivide once per beat. So I can just count triplets here, quintuplets here. This is just a grace note after the and, etc., all the way through. Now, that said, this bottom one is really easy to follow, but there's no, I mean, if this was how the piece was notated, what does it all mean? I mean, the player would have no idea what's going on or why this happens this way. So in this case, John's notation is a good compromise. You can figure out what's going on here, and you can also come up with a version. This is actually not the only one. I found out from the dedicatee of the piece, Steve Drury, who was a former teacher of mine, mentioned he had rewritten this whole thing to have five beats per measure, and you have actually fewer of these moments where you have to approximate one voice in terms of the rhythm of the other, but it almost doesn't really matter too much. Let me just, in terms of one of my favorite examples of notational synonyms, it comes from this piece. This is a big piano piece, early spectral piece from the late 70s. And what's interesting, I mean, this was where it's a 30-minute piece where you floor the pedal and just listen to resonances the whole time. But what's interesting about this from a notational point of view is that he uses multiple different synonyms at various times depending on the context. And one's right at the beginning here. If you notice, you have these little figures where there's a little box with a pattern, and then he tells you to repeat it over a certain period of time. Here, 4 seconds, gradually turning into this. Actually, hear them, and there are a whole bunch of them. Maybe you can see a little bit bigger, but they look something like this. So here's it's a quintuplet, 2 + 3, ba 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 ba, and you gradually speed up, get louder until you have a tremolo. And then a later iterations of it, then you speed up to some kind of rhythm here. Because you notice that the tuplet gets smaller, I'm assuming what it means is that, or I'm interpreting it to mean that it ends up not being as fast as it goes progressively. And you notice the period of time also increases. And then a couple pages in, he renotates this whole idea like this. And you can see it on the top system, we still have the 2 + 3, 2 + 3, and then gradually, as these continues as 2 + 3, it's just, he's written it in faster until at some point it turns into just an even attack. And then we end up with something, the 9 is not too much faster, you see, than the 11 before. And then later on, there's again the same kind of thing. He gets even slower there, and it's over a much longer period of time. And part of the reason for this is he wants to put these other pitches in, and this is a way of doing it. But also, even if these pitches weren't here, his roadmap is actually really useful, because as a thought experiment, I calculated how many seconds it would take to go from here to here. And something like this would be much harder to do. I mean, spacing this out is not a very big change anymore over a long period of time. This would be much, much harder without a roadmap. Whereas if we back up compared to this one, which is, it's a much shorter period of time, you're getting to a tremolo. This is very straightforward and doesn't necessarily benefit from having it written out in a kind of rhythmic approximation. Whereas this one, well, even without the pitches, it actually, it makes a lot of sense. One thing so far, these have all been with respect to rhythm. I guess as a pianist, I'm cursed to always be counting, but it's certainly, you do see this kind of synonymous notation elsewhere besides in rhythm. Actually, I don't have a slide for it, but I had a piece recently where it was this a new contemporary piece, but very traditional writing based on folk music. But practically every note had its own dynamic marking, like something you would see in Boulez or Stockhausen. And I remember thinking, what in the world's going on? And I realized what it was. You'd have like some kind of melodic line, say 3 notes, and the first note would be piano, and then the next one would be mezzo forte, and the next one would be piano. Something that it was clearly a musical line that would swell and then recede again, but it was notated in a very literal way for pianists, because of course when we play a note, we don't have any control over what the line does until we play the very next note. So a very didactic approach, as opposed to putting hairpins, which is how I would have imagined it. But that's another example of a non-rhythmic synonym. Here's actually, this is kind of a silly one, but this is from Chopin. This is a nocturne, and I have it notated 2 different ways. And just as I don't know, anyone, a pianist here, or anyone want to take a guess as to which one of these which one is the imposter and which one is actually Chopin's notation? The difference here is in the left hand. Here it's notated with pedal markings, and here it's notated with an articulation marking. But you see that if following these instructions, you would get this kind of notation. So this is very much clearly a series of instructions, and this is more a schematic for how it's supposed to sound. I don't know, I can't actually see. So just if anyone wants to shout out, I can't actually see hands, or.
I think the first one is Chopin's version.
Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right. The first one is Chopin's version. I have another slide. You can actually see, it's small, but you can see all the obsessive pedal markings and the staccatos. And for whatever reason, Chopin was I think of him as sort of the prototype of the didactic notator, where everything is done as a series of instructions and not so much as a schematic. And the pedal is kind of an example of this. My theory about this is that he was so immersed in amateur music making culture. He spent his whole career essentially as a piano teacher for French high society. And when you're teaching adult beginners, I mean, the pedal is a real problem. And so him writing pedal down, pedal up, pedal down, it was a kind of necessary thing, and he internalized it so much. In some ways, I think the opposite in terms of a traditional composer would be Debussy, who was kind of the consummate professional. I mean, for example, there are no pedal markings practically in Debussy's music, and clearly you're supposed to use pedal. And there are a lot of things pedal-wise that are physically impossible, or in terms of holding things down. But he trusts that it's more the score is a kind of schematic. This is supposed to be a representation for how it's supposed to sound, and you, the performer, you figure it out. And I have to say that I kind of, in terms of, and obviously the devil's in the details, but I kind of prefer the second thing, having it as a kind of schematic, not so much as a set of instructions, and then for me to figure out what to do with that. So I recognize that different pianists will like different things. And then, of course, the danger is with this kind of schematic where you make the idea very clear is when you get to scores that are to a certain degree unfinished. I mean, even you could say that this bottom one is a little bit unfinished because it doesn't tell you how to do this. It just tells you, and of course you finish it pretty easily. But to give an example, a much harder example, this is from the same Mirai piece. This is later on. So this is a section, I'll summarize his footnotes. The two hands, at this point, at the exclamation point, the two hands are no longer coordinated in any notated way. And the left hand goes through this long pattern. I think it eventually settles on this 32 note pattern that repeats. And when the intervals are big, you're supposed to play it slower. And then as the intervals get smaller, you speed up, essentially a 2 to 3 ratio here. And then you just kind of go back and forth and keep repeating this long pattern. And then the right hand, meanwhile, starts with a pattern, and which he asks you to repeat 2 to 4 times until you gradually turn it into this pattern, and then take a pattern, repeat 3 to 5 times, speeding up until it turns into this. And you gradually go through, it's a couple pages. And at some point he marks, oh, now here are the two hands, when both hands end up vamping on a pattern to come back together, and then he notates it normally. And so of course the question for the interpreter is, how in the world do you deal with this? Because there's to a certain extent, the idea is really clear, but the approach to realization is not at all clear. And I mean, I'll give an example. One of my first instinct was to actually come up with a version following these rules. And I tried doing a spatial notation. This is a very, you can see how quickly I abandoned this and thought, the hell with this. And then I booted up Sibelius and tried to notate a version with Sibelius. I assumed that this 2 to 3, that there were 5 notes in between this, so I could turn this into a long quintuplet. So it ended up looking like something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, duple, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, triple. So it would approximate the fluctuation in tempo on the left hand, and then trying to notate the right hand with rhythms. And you can see where I gave up there. And I went back to essentially just kind of struggling through it. I think actually and for all I know, Mirai probably went through this same process composing this 40 years ago, whatever, and decided, this is the way it has to be. I think it works because the pedal's floored, so it really sounds like masses of sound, and you don't have to worry about very precise things being articulated necessarily. Another example of sort of a kind of, this is a piece I've never played. I don't know if you guys are familiar. This is it's this really, really beautiful, very quiet piece. And this is the first of, it's pretty short, it's about 4 pages. But he indicates, each system has a different time signature. And you're supposed to play the first 2 systems together, so that this one has the pulse is slightly faster than this one. And then when you get to the end of the first line, then you do the second and third systems, and you play these together, and you go through the piece like that. And it's one of these things with the notation, it seems just impossibly hard. I'm not even sure how to approach this, except that I know that I could take each line, figure out how many seconds it's supposed to be, and then figure out at which point every note is supposed to be, and just turn it into a kind of spatial notation. It kind of reminds me a bit of, which of course would be a very different process, and the result would probably be really different. I mentioned I was at UCSD. One of the people there is this very famous percussionist, Steve Schick, who there's a percussion solo he commissioned from Brian Ferneyhoo. You're probably familiar with Brian's music, with all the nested tuplets and the complexes stuff the British composers were crazy about in the 80s. And anyway, so it's this 150 or so measures of just impossibly hard rhythms. And all the percussion students, everyone, you come to study with Steve, they all learned bone alphabet at some point. And I used to quiz them, you're like, so how are you doing it? How are you? And the answers I would get were all over the map. Like there was one student who essentially used a Word document to create a spatial score and learned it from that. Another one just plugged it into MIDI and just learned the whole thing by ear. which I guess is cheating, but I mean, it's just a different way of approach. It's not an approach suggested by the notation, but it's a way of dealing with the notation. Okay, I'll end with one last piece. This is the I think the hardest piece I've attempted. I mean, I did learn it as a student and recorded it. This is Stockhausen. This is his piano piece number 10. This is the first page. It's very artistic score. And it's this crazy piece where you wear these fingerless gloves and there are lots of palm glissandi later on and arm clusters. After I used to joke to people that what I did, I banged on pianos with my elbows because so much of this piece was like that. But actually the hardest part of the piece is the rhythmic notation. And it's these durations at the top. So the way he sets up the rhythm, it's more or less free from rhythmic duration to rhythmic duration, except that when the line goes up, you're supposed to speed up, the attacks speed up. And when the line goes down, the attacks slow down. And when it's even, they stay even. And these are sort of grace notes within that. And then all of this is supposed to be a certain number of beats. So in this case, it would be what, 8.5 beats from here to here, and then a half a beat here, and then a quarter and a 16th from here to here. And then and the way I remember learning it was I took this system and I created a version. I decided, well, the eighth note is going to be my unit of time. And this is what, 17 eighth notes. And that helps that there's a fermata here, so you get a little room to fudge things. And I created a version, an eighth note will go here, an eighth note wherever it happens to be. And then I went through the whole piece like this. And it made it 10 times harder than it would have been had you not had this kind of constraint. And the funny thing is that I remember there was when I was a grad student when I was learning this, and there was another composer who he was a good pianist too. We'd meet and just show each other what we were working on, and I played a few of his pieces. And I once asked him, I said, hey, I'm thinking of learning this. What do you think of this notation? Well, I don't know how I would deal with this stuff. What would you do? And he looks at it and he says, oh, but it's so easy. And I said, all right, yeah, tell me. And he says, oh, you just ignore them. And the funny thing is, of course, it would be very different. As a student, I couldn't do that at all. But now I think that you spend with this notation, you spend so much time on something that's not necessarily or not audible in an immediate way. Anyway, the funny thing, one last thing about this piece, that it was actually kind of influential for a number of other pieces. I'm sure you're familiar with the Berlioz sequenzas, and the piano sequenza number 4 was modeled a lot. He cribbed a lot of this notation off this piece. And there's a more recent piece by a French composer whose stuff I play, Philippe Mannery. And there's one of Mannery's pieces that essentially he borrows a lot from this notation, and it visually looks a lot like this. I'll give an example of the score, but for these parts, all he does is he just says it's free time. It's pretty much what my composer friend suggested. It's just not where, and there is something satisfying about then you spend more time listening and not so much counting. Let me actually get out of this and back to stop share. Here we go. And then in terms of my prepared presentation, that's it. I'm happy though if anyone is. I have imagined this to be a kind of more freewheeling office hours too. So I'm happy to just open things up to questions or comments or protests or whatever. And actually the chat. I'm really terrible with Zoom, so maybe it might be better just to shout things out. But I'll try to.
I do have a question, Will. It's a simple question. For that Chopin's example, which one would you prefer?
Oh, the articulate, not Chopin's, the slurs.
Oh, okay.
I generally except with those later cases where it's so where generally I prefer almost slightly less finished score, where that it's more the idea and less the specific instructions. But obviously some of those, something like that Beat Führer piece, I think that I don't, I mean, to actually engage that notation the way he's notated there is, I don't have that kind of time. Maybe when I was a student I might have, but I don't have that time. I would turn it into yeah. What's one of your favorite
yeah.
just favorite contemporary compositions for piano that weren't mentioned? I mean, I'll give a shout out. Philippe Monnery's piano pieces I really like. That the very last one is his second sonata, but both his first sonata and second sonatas I think are really terrific. I think of other things I've done fairly recently where they want. Oh, another composer I really like, Lee Hyla. He died a few years ago, unfortunately. He has a couple great piano pieces. There's one called Riff and Transfiguration, another one called Basic Training, and it's his music is really terrific. Those are the ones that jump out at me. I like Murray's music generally, though. I think that big piece from the 70s is really his best, and I think the later stuff hasn't been quite as good in terms of piano music. But yeah, I definitely like things that will give me a little room to make decisions. And where, I mean, the Stockhausen example, I don't know if I would, I mean, Stockhausen is famous for trying to control every aspect of his performers, but I would, at this point, I don't know if I could stand going through that anymore. So maybe just at this point in my life.
Will, funny that you said, you know, with the Beat piece, well, you know, that notation, I mean, I just don't have time for that anymore. So I would just like make another version of it. And I'm thinking, well, that's also time.
Yeah, that is time. It's a different
That
time.
very, let's just be honest. And this is, you know, I think I love that you're talking conceptual and practical, but then there's this sort of another type of practicality. And that is that the fact is, the vast majority of pianists, even those who specialize in new music, are not going to open up Finale or Sibelius and make some other version. They won't. They'll just either fake the piece or they won't play the piece.
Right.
So you're already in a very select, you know, kind of subset of performers who are super dedicated, obviously. I'm kind of blown away. The first time I had that happen to me, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago for Passepartout for muted piano and muted snare drum. And it has a lot of some of the similar things going on, multiple layers in the piano and blah, blah, blah. And they got back to me and they sent me a score. They had redone the entire score without asking me, you know, just doing it to make it more practical for them. And I was like, oh, first of all, I'm totally guilt-ridden. They have spent, I don't even know how many hours doing this, and that's not my job, or I feel like it's my job as a composer to not make performers do that. And then they got back to, and then of course, so from now on, what I do is I send the score out with both versions, and then players can, you know, ensembles can use whatever they want. It's been performed all over the world, but I have no idea which version is used more than the others. But I mean, one thing I think a lot about, and I talk to my own students about, is logistical realities. Not every new music ensemble or new music soloist has the time or dedication to go through the process which you're describing. I mean, you're like super, a lot of them, some of the best new music performers, I'm sure you know, and I know, part of their job is to go from one piece to the next.
Right.
They don't have the luxury of dwelling on a piece and renotating it when there are you know, thousands of living composers, young and old, who are sending them pieces, and they want to program, and they have to get through new music. Like every concert is 5 new pieces,
Right. Yeah.
probably not be played again, but they have to learn, rep fast. So I tell my students, when there's 5 choices to make, you always make the one that's going to be easiest for the player. That's like rule number 1, rule number 2, rule number 3, rule number 4. And then rule 5, 6, 7 is like what you want to do intentionally, but you have to make it easier for the performer.
In a way that's almost too bad though, because then you don't, I mean, the reason why, I mean, I don't know if this is how I got into this gig in the first place, but the reason why I stay interested in what, when I pick repertoire, when I pick it for myself, is that it offers interesting challenges. And, you know, it's like, it's not where, but also I'm definitely not the kind of performer, I don't have the kind of career where I'm doing 60 premieres a year or something like that. It reminds me a little bit of a conversation I remember once between Anthony Tomasini, who's the chief music critic of the New York Times, and Alex Ross. And they were talking about how each envied the other, because Alex Ross envied Tomasini because he was first, you know, he'd write the review, he was first. And Tomasini said, well, he envied Alex Ross because he would, after a month of the opera running, or he would come and write this long article talking about what he felt was its impact or whatever, as opposed to being first. So I'm definitely not the Tomasini in that, to extend the metaphor. I'm not going to have the huge repertoire necessarily, or even don't have that many performing gigs. So I'd rather be a little bit choosy and spend time with pieces. In some ways, for a festival, I find that, and I don't do lots of these gigs, but where it's premiering pieces, I think that you want to almost find a moderate sweet spot. So if the piece is sight readable, then the performers will probably sight read it. And if it's too impossibly hard, then they'll just say, oh, forget it, you know, just, then it's faked. And if you get somewhere in between where it takes a little bit of work, but then that's really kind of where you want it to be, because then they'll put time into it, because it's a reasonable amount of time, and it will, you know, it'll sound good, and then it'll be more satisfying for the player too. So I always, the ones that were completely sight readable, I always kind of felt bad for the ensemble, for the composer, because, you know, we had so much music to get through that we were going to sight read this one. And then the really hard ones is like, okay, let's just fake it. And then the ones in between, okay, all right, let's rehearse this and get this right. So it's kind of
Exactly what I said. Yeah.
So there's a kind of, I mean, but certainly if things are super easy, then it's not really, okay, it's great, I do the gig. But I do like interesting challenges. And so but I think that there's a difference between interesting and then where it's so arbitrary. And that gets into the Ferniho territory, where I just can't, when it gets to all the nested tuplets with the nested tuplets, and I ask why, you know, just to actually engage with that in a good faith way, is the amount of time is just incredible. That's the kind of thing, I guess, when you're a student that you do, but after that, it's just hard to. But it's funny you mentioned also about renotate. I remember hearing about the Arditi quartet, where they would renotate all the time, and they were really good at finding a way to rethink of something. Because in some ways that you're taking advantage, everything's become so specialized, so you're taking advantage of the player's expertise, where they just do so much of this that they have a sense, well, if I thought of it this way, then. And so that I think that I think as best it should be a kind of, I mean, collaboration in terms of I think of it in, you know, in physics, at least in most physics departments, they have theoreticians and experimentalists. So I'm sort of the experimentalist, and so the theoretician will come up with this idea, but not have any idea how to test it, and that becomes the experimentalist. And there's a certain creativity, the different kind of creativity, but they both have to require. Great video on YouTube with it. Oh, okay, I'm just looking at the chat of the RDD quartet rehearsing. I say I've never played any Ferniho. I don't. It's too bad, because I actually like listening to it. So I think I'll go to a concert and I'll enjoy it, and someone else can count the rhythm.
Speaking of Bat Fur, I have a question
Oh yeah, sure.
that's highly specific, I guess, but maybe will snowball into something.
Okay.
So there's this piece, Phasma. I don't know if how well this piece is known here, but I'm putting a link in the chat. And
Okay.
it starts with this, I think it's 3/8, or it's triple meter, but the division of the triple meter is into quintuplets. And this essentially, I mean, it's one of these pieces where the meter's only there for alignment.
Mhm.
I had a professor tell me one time where if you're using the meter in such a way, he likes to default to 3/4 or whatever, and just let tuplets fall where they may, in such a way that they don't cross bars or whatever, as opposed to 4/4. And that always kind of like struck me as odd. But clearly he's doing the same kind of thing, because later the quintuplet, or uh, I guess 4 tuplets will show up, and then the regular division of the triple meter. So I'm kind of curious what you think of this, and if you could maybe notate this in a different way if you were the composer.
Me, I can take a look at, like, well, let's see. Is there without me playing the video, is there a way I can just sort of, hold on. Just without playing this?
I could take a screenshot and put a
Yeah,
link in the
maybe,
chat to
yeah.
download if you want.
Oh, wait, yeah, here I see. Okay, hold on one sec. Oh, let's see. Let me just make this bigger so I can see it.
This happens over the course of the first 4 or so minutes,
Yeah,
and the
so-
different subdivisions drop in at different points.
Okay. I mean, initially I would just start with, just count. This looks like it. I mean, so these are essentially quintuplets in each, and then it changes.
Yeah, there's an overlay, I think, with 4 tuplets.
Oh, I see. And
This is more of a compositional question almost,
Right.
because I mean, if I were just starting this piece, I would probably just be like, oh, this is 5/8.
Right, yeah, that is weird. That, yeah, I would think of it as 5/8. And this
But
is all for
then the
one
problem is
player?
like,
Oh,
sorry?
Yeah, this is solo piano. Yeah, and then
Yeah, I mean, the problem being like when you want the other subdivisions to come in, how do you retroactively make the decision as to which one is the most legible? And that goes back to what I was told by my professor a long time ago, which is, just default to 3. It's the easiest to read somehow. And that always kind of struck me as arbitrary.
Yeah, no, I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that kind of thing. I would use the steady one as the continuous one as as the one that I count, and then the other note. Think of the other one in terms of that. So this would be a grace note before this. Figure out what it is mathematically, but then that one is a grace note before, for example, the third quintuplet or something, and
Okay.
just. I mean, I guess I'm a firm believer in this kind of thing in terms of multitasking, that it doesn't really exist, that really we only have one brain that can do one thing at a single time. So the idea of subdivide, like that John said, I'm subdividing in 2 different ways at the same time. That's not, you don't really do that. And I'm kind of an outlier as a pianist too, where I don't really believe in hand separate practicing. I mean, beyond this, figuring out the fingering, whatever. It's what you're doing is it's not like you're learning one hand really well and the other one, and then you control them both in this kind of and separate parts of your brain. You learn one composite, and so that in as much as there is counterpoint, or we hear that, it's really just an illusion that the player creates. So
Right.
this kind of thing I would always, and I would in this case, even though the second part, the bottom one, that those are the events that the listener will. Those are the things that happen. The other point is fairly continuous. I would still be counting the one that's continuous, and then just almost re-notate that. I mean, not exactly, but in terms of the other rhythm. So that I'd only keep track of one rhythm. And I often think in terms of grace notes. This is a grace note before, this is a grace note after, this is right in the middle. I mean, usually it's either in between 2 beats, close to the middle, or it's close to a grace note on one side or the other. And that's actually a useful way of, I mean, if you have to perform polyrhythms, It's divide when things go in between other. You're really playing one thing evenly and playing the other one inside that, and it's either this attack is in between two attacks, or it's a grace note off on one end or the other.
Okay.
And then an
So
approximation, but
would it be fair to say that you prefer to see the bar or the meter or whatever, even though the meter is relatively arbitrary, maybe, to be established immediately with the subdivision?
I don't think that I think it's weird for him to write that as a quintuplet rather than just doing a 5/8. But actually, it doesn't often that kind of thing. If it is kind of arbitrary, I will create my own organization based on where the attacks are. So
Okay.
things that work really well. So for example, it might not always be straight 5/8 measures, but this one works whether as a 4/8 and then a 6/8, and then based on what the figures are. And that does change it a little bit, because of course the way it's divided suggests strong and weak beats. But especially if there's a note saying that it's like in Ligeti etudes where he says it doesn't mean anything where the bar lines go. I feel perfectly fine just saying, all right, I'm going to reimagine new bar or new strong moments. Ligeti etudes is a perfect example where often the physical requirements determine where these things happen. When my two hands do this, that's going to be a quote downbeat, regardless of where it is. But that probably doesn't matter so much, and it's actually, in terms of dealing with notation, that Führer piece, it doesn't seem that bad. It's
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I've always been curious about that piece, especially from a point of view of someone more skilled than me able to play it, maybe.
Well, I only know that the voicelessness, which I know is not at all representative of his music, but that's the only piece of his that I had a lot of classmates play it just over the years in school.
Well, I highly recommend this one to anyone who hasn't heard it. It's got all the Beat for tropes with the like the duh, 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 but it's really great.
Okay. I don't know if anything else about this or any other.
I would actually like to hear your thoughts on a debate. I'm
Yeah.
sure you've heard before. It seems interesting to me and a whole lot of other people I know that when we omit things like super specific dynamics and pedal markings, articulations and stuff, then it becomes this schematic that a performer can figure out on their own. But when we omit rhythms and like specific notes, then it becomes aleatoric, which is like this whole other idea. Like we push that as like separate from our practice. And I wonder if you think of this, I mean, really maybe this whole conversation is just about aleatoric notation in other parameters besides pitch and rhythm.
Yeah, well, pitch and rhythm, it's more how the notation has evolved, where those are the things that clearly we, regardless of what the listener's experience might be, those are the things that clearly are important. I mean, based on the notation, which is funny. I think dynamics are one in terms of the listener's experience. Boy, that's a big one, and the notation doesn't acknowledge in that way. And part of it comes from the instrument. I mean, I think early instruments, the whole notion of being able to vary your dynamic, that wasn't, you wanted something loud, get a lot of people together, and that's loud. And if you wanted it soft, and you guys stop playing, and you guys in the middle, you guys play, and that's sort of how it was. But I guess I think of it more in terms of not aleatoric, but almost, or I guess it depends on what it is, almost improvisational. So if you're thinking what the pitches and rhythms aren't, and so there's a series of instructions in terms of what to do. And I guess depending on how difficult the result would be, I would either improvise something or come up with a version. The closest I can think of the example, I don't do very much improvising. I play in this duo, or used to. I mean, pre-COVID, we did a lot of playing together with this percussionist up in Indianapolis. Scott Deal is a terrific musician. He's the head of their computer music, or their music and technology up at essentially Indiana University in Indianapolis. And he has a piece we played several times called Goldstream Variations, which is, it's a completely graphics, 5 movements of this graphic score. And there are rules, these are the pitches you can use. And it's these fragments, but it's not even rhythms really, it's just kind of suggested shapes, and you have to come up, and there are rules for each of the movements. And it was kind of fun to come up with, because especially I'm not really much of an improviser, but we're playing the gig. And 2 of the 5 movements I wrote out very clearly. I practiced. These are the fragments I would use, and it was almost like one of those Stockhausen choose your own adventure scores where you'd have a bunch and you could just grab any of those. But I had practiced because it was hard. It was really tough. And then the other 3, it was easy enough that I could just kind of improvise it on the go. And it's not, but I guess I'm also so far removed from school in the sense of even this discussion of what's aleatoric and what's not, that it's more a question of how finished the score is, or how much of that is required of me to interpret. And obviously when you deal with pitches and rhythms, then obviously there's more work, or more to flesh out than, or it's more work to flesh it out than if it's something like fewer dynamic markings, or but I mean that's the experience in playing Bach, for example, where there are no dynamic markings. And I mean I don't know, there's no way I would play without dynamics, without making full use of the instrument. And there's a certain there's a certain fun creativity involved in saying, well, all right, what could I do? Especially because it's such an anachronism. This is even the instrument you're playing is really anachronistic. And what kinds of things does the music naturally suggest to me? And I think one of the most fun things with all that older music is my instinct suggests one thing. What would happen if I did the exact opposite? And it might crash and burn, and that would confirm my instincts. But some of my best moments with Baroque music have been with where I get something surprising when I do the exact opposite of what I think the music naturally suggests. And that's kind of part of the fun of being an interpreter. I think in some ways the apex of interpretation is doing something that no one's heard before. I mean, someone may have heard the piece dozens of times, but you want to listen and think, wow, I've never heard it done that way. And how has it ever been done any other way? That's a pretty tall order, but that's sort of my idea of the very, very height of interpretation.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I don't know if there are other questions. I know this was supposed to be an hour. I don't have a.
It's all right if we have time for like a couple more questions if people want. Yeah.
I don't want to like monopolize the discussion or anything, but I've got another one so kind of relating to that, and especially interpretation of dynamics and the Ligeti etudes. In some of them, like, Devil's Staircase, Ligeti will write like, 5 fortes or whatever. And the discussion about this that I've seen, it seems it's like so emotional and just like, Ligeti thinks he can write 5 fortes. But he seems to like be kind of trying to make his own like dynamic scale, and the way that I understood it was that things are relative maybe, but I feel like this is a thing that's endemic to a lot of piano music where the composer has this liberty to kind of make his own dynamic scale. I mean, and this might map onto certain other parameters, but I'm wondering your thoughts about like kind of choosing to use notation in a way where the connotations kind of differ from maybe the desired effect.
Right. I mean, actually, specifically with the dynamics and Ligeti, I put almost no thought into it. It's just like, I mean, there's all right, but there are how many different divisions of I mean, the dynamic is relative, and it's our perception of it. We can only have a sense of a certain grade. So already, even if we say that, you know, like in the Devil's Staircase, where there are 9 fortes or however many there are, and at some point there are 7 pianos, as it's almost just a kind, it's almost like a, you know, it's like this is really big, and so he keeps writing in the Fs, and this is really soft, and he keeps writing the Ps, and it almost ceases to be meaningful. Actually, my current interest with Ligeti Etudes has to do with, and I've been, over the pandemic, I've been obsessed with a Vertige, you know, Vertigo.
Yeah.
9. It's my old teacher at NEC, Steve Drury, said that was the hardest one. And I played a couple of the other ones when I was a student. And so pandemic, where everyone kind of stuck here, I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. And it became a kind of obsession for several months. But my interest with it has to do with dealing with this constant tempo. And, you know, the funny thing, it's supposed to go as fast as possible. And then he even gives you a tempo for it, which is not that fast in the first couple of pages. I mean, it's ba 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 ba. But I was like, well, you know, I can play that about 50% faster. I can't keep that tempo up. And clearly, he's found the absolute fastest tempo that you could play the hardest parts with. And then so you do. But you know, there was something like, well, why do we have to keep that? Is it possible for me to, instead of doing his tempo and keeping that steady tempo, and that's clearly that's what most people do, and that's what it is, could I start it a whole lot faster and then find some way to create the obviously when I need to make a kind of concession, you know, I can't keep it up and there's some parts that are harder, can I hide that within a kind of musically expressive gesture? So or something like that. And it also then when you have these different, you know, that it actually reminds me of this quote from Moby Dick, Herman Melville. There's this great scene where he's in these freezing Nantucket nights, and he's in bed and he's just trying to stay warm. He doesn't have any money for a fire in the fireplace or anything. And so, I mean, he's just huddled, but he sticks his foot out so that some part, even as he's warm under the covers, some part of him is still cold. And that's the only way to feel truly warm, is for some part of you to be cold. And with the Ligeti, I think, well, if it's all kind of this mediocre fast, we don't have a sense of it being fast. But if it does slow down and grind to almost a halt in the really hard parts, then boy, when it takes off, you have this sense of actual speed. Anyway, so it's a work in progress, but I have this idea of playing it where the tempo really fluctuates. And the other part of that is also, I do my day job, so to speak. I teach at a college, so I'm teaching a lot of some advanced pianists, playing mostly Chopin lists, that kind of thing. And I have to talk a lot about musical expression and what that means, and how I come up with a way of talking about it. And the best way I've been able to articulate it has been musical expression being it's a kind of performance of effort overcoming resistance. And that as pianists, we get very, very good at simulating that. So for example, when you're playing a singing melodic line in a Chopin nocturne or something, obviously playing one note to the next, it doesn't matter what note it is. But if you imagine the difficulty of a singer or someone who had to tune every pitch, and you simulate that sense of difficulty, it gives you some kind of roadmap for how to approach it in a very musical way, even though obviously for the pianist, it doesn't matter what note it is, I'm just depressing levers. And the weird thing though, is that in etude, here's a case where we don't have to simulate it. It's the difficulty is actually there. And yet we're all trained to hide, you have to make it sound like you're just tossing it off and it's the easiest thing in the world, when it's like, but that, in some ways that's a missed opportunity. So the sense of, well, here we don't have to simulate the difficulty. And so my interest with the Ligeti Etudes is actually more to do with how to create this sense of expression, but it's really this physical resistance and the effort overcoming it, but using a fluctuation in the tempo in order to bring that across. It certainly allows you to play the easier parts of Vertige much faster than you would if you had to keep he wants it as a kind of, it's more of a texture where it's just a constant background. And I'm thinking of it more as this kind of dramatic gesture. Think of almost like a solo violin etude or something, where it's much more physical. So anyway, someday it's a lot of work. I mean, however you decide to play that piece, but that's been my idea with that.
Cool. It's really
But
interesting.
that's not hadn't really anything to do with the dynamics, except that I mean that in some ways our sense of how big something is. I mean, there's only so loud the instrument's going to get. So a really useful pianistic device is, of course, to stretch time in order to give the illusion that something is large. I mean, it's how you deal with Sforzandi and Beethoven. I mean, that's a big object, it bends time around it.
Mhm.
But
Cool.
so that's, I guess, another way you could approach it. The more Fs, and it slows, but then if it slows down, it's harder to get lots of sound. I don't know.
I see.
Anyway, the number of dynamic markings, I've just kind of ignored. I mean, it's
Yeah.
But what do I do with that?
Right.
All right. Looks like our numbers are dwindling a little, but I mean, any other question? Great. Or if not, I'm shocked. I've been trying to tune in as the day goes on. I have to log out to take my kids to camps because it's summertime, but I've been trying to catch as much as possible. So I'm sure I will see you guys as an audience member too. And I think the concert is tomorrow, or at least my concert's tomorrow. In terms of shameless plugs.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Oh, yeah,
Will.
sure.
That was really fantastic.
Okay,
And I'm super excited for your concert tomorrow.
Great.
So yeah, everyone definitely come by and check that out because it's going to be great.
Okay. Yeah.
And we have a concert tonight at 8 p.m. It's going to be Spatial Forces. So yeah, everybody come check that out as well. Best place to go is the Charlotte Music YouTube.
YouTube. Okay. Yeah. That's
All
good.
right, thanks
General, for
everybody.
most concerts, is it?
Thanks, Will.
Oh yeah. Okay. All right, thanks.
Sorry, Will, did you have a question?
So it's a YouTube is the place to view, not Facebook, is that?
Yeah, the concerts will be on Facebook, but YouTube is good because people can comment and it just looks nice and it's easy to see. And it's slightly better quality as well, I think.
Okay, sure.
All right, thank you so much, Will.
Okay, yeah, thank you.